All right, we welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest in our show. Today's guest, Sarthak Dev, is someone whose writing I've really enjoyed. And this is a podcast that I'm really excited about because there are lots of topics and themes that he writes about that I just particularly enjoy. So, a little bit about Sarthak before we jump into this conversation. Sarthak is a writer and music composer. In a previous life, he was a software engineer, though not a very good one. He writes a Substack called Lines in the Grass about sports, music, books, book reviews, and more. He also sporadically puts out some of his music on either YouTube or Instagram, depending on how his coffee tasted in that morning. So, Sarthak, thank you for making time for this. I'm really excited about this episode and, to pick your thoughts, to pick your brain about how you do what you do. I've been a fan of Lines on the Grass and also your music on YouTube. But to get started, Sarthak, the first question I wanted to ask you was, what was Sarthak like growing up? What were you curious about at school? Were you born a writer and a musician, or where did that inclination come from? So tell me a little bit about Sarthak growing up.
Thanks for having me over, Abhishek. That was a very kind intro, and thanks for all the nice words. I was most definitely not born a writer or a musician. I don't know if I'm still one yet, but I was definitely not born one. I was born into a family that breathes sport, they inhaled and exhaled sport every day, to the point where I was very young, if it was not some TV shows, and I think back in the day the TV shows were really starting to kick on, there was some form of sport on the TV, which is, it could be cricket, football, tennis, definitely the Olympics and the Commonwealth and the Asian Games, a lot of badminton, hockey. And one, amongst the many, parts of luck here, one great part of luck was none of it was centric to, okay, our team is playing, so only we will watch that. So we were watching Ivanisevic play Pat Rafter, and it was cool. It was not just because, okay, granddad is an Agassi fan, I was a Sampras fan, so we would only watch those games. So it was a lot of that. My education into sports was fairly young. I was taken to stadiums when I was very young, and so the love for it started from there. At no point was I thinking, okay, I need to be a writer or anything like that. And a lot of my education was what you would call the great Indian educational cliche, which is from a very early age, you are told, okay, engineering, computer science, IIT, BITS, and all that. Growing up, I was obsessed with sport, listened to a lot of music, because grandmom was also a musician, so listened to a lot of music at home that way. But it would be a stretch to say that there was an inclination to make this my professions when I was very
young. Two things you said that I'd like to deep dive on. One was those conversations with your grandfather, and then the fact that your grandmom was also a musician. Because I feel like as a child growing up, there can be several unconscious influences on the things you are interested in. And sometimes an adult that does something in an engaged way over a period of time can actually get you thinking about something in a different way. So can you tell me, maybe share a few stories about an incident with your dad related to sports and writing about it, and maybe a story about, learning music with or talking about music with your grandmom. I'd love to know about these two tangents, if that's okay.
Right. So I was born in Calcutta, and then I moved to, our entire family moved to Delhi when I was 5. And the reason I mention this is because granddad always believed that all of us should be able to speak, read, and write Bangla. The rest of my family knew how to, obviously, were very fluent with the language because they had grown up and spent most of their lives in Calcutta. And because I was going to grow up in Delhi, one thing he did from when I must have been 6 or 7, and I was obsessed with newspapers. I would read before going to school, and I would come back and read the sports pages after. Is he said, okay, every day during the holidays or weekends, if you can translate one paragraph or a small passage of the Bangla newspaper into English and vice versa, that's one extra packet of gems a month, I guess. So something like that. Those were my rewards, and I was very happy with those rewards. I quite disliked when he gave me pan parag, but that's for a different day. Um, uh, but the liking for the written words started from there. When I was reading newspapers as a kid, I read it because it was just more information about the things I was watching on TV. So I wanted to have more of it. And it was very like stupid and silly. I would just read and not necessarily process it, but just read it because I was getting to read about your Tendulkars and your Brazils and Rivaldos and Ronaldos. And I don't think Granddad did it to, put in a liking for the written word, but mostly to just get fluent with Bangla. Then I think it was during the '99 World Cup, and if I remember correctly, it was Australia playing West Indies, because there was some history to that game. Because just previously to the World Cup, Australia had gone to the West Indies, and it was a cracker of a series. So he said, "Okay, you're writing, a passage every day. Why don't you do this? These are the summer holidays. It was a May and June World Cup. You're going to watch the game any which way. So why don't you just write me what you saw? Just write a longer. You're writing these 100, 200 word passages. Just write a report on the game." And that too, I think, came from the perspective of just, keep him engaged. Don't make him ask for more glasses of Rasna. So that was, I think, the first time I wrote about sport, and still from a very like, okay, I'll write because I'm watching any which way. And it was written in a very blow by blow manner, because my exposure to the written word was also just the newspapers. And especially about sports, I was reading the Sports Star magazines and here and there, but I guess I was still too young to understand how long form writing works and how is it different from, say, newspaper writing, so to speak. So it was a lot of that. I'd started writing about games that I was watching any which way. Eventually, the more Sports Star, and there was a Hindi similar magazine called Sports Samrat, and Wisden was very rare because Wisden Cricket Monthly, which is now Cricket Info Monthly, those were expensive and those were not easily accessible. So those were rare, but I read a lot of long form writing in my Sports Stars and Sports Weeklies, all those magazines. And I think slowly there was an appreciation of the color and the context these pieces provided. Like when a Rohit Brijnath would write, when a Prem Panikar would write, when a Shard Dogra would write, they would write in a lot of depth about, okay, Tendulkar scoring 100 against Australia. Whereas in newspapers, for justified reasons, I was reading that, okay, in over number 1, he took on Kasprovic, and over number 2, he took on McGrath. Where in a Sports Star, I would get more information about why it mattered. I would get more information about why it was important that Ivanisevic was in the final against Pat Rafter in 2001, in the Wimbledon final, because the last time he went to the finals was in '92. He had a crazy game, but Agassi won that game. And obviously, I wasn't watching Wimbledon in '92. But all that context came in these long form pieces. So there was an appreciation that I liked this stuff more, and I wanted to read more of this stuff. It was still, there was no inclination of, oh, okay, I want to write like this. It was just that this is the kind of stuff I like reading. And I remember reading a couple of sports books. And by the time I was 14, 15, I remember reading Beyond the Boundary by C.L.R. James. And it was a transformative book for me because I couldn't believe that sports could be written like this. And in a to draw a very silly, obvious segue, it was like listening to Yanni. And I couldn't believe that a piano player could do that. With a piano and his his band, so to speak. Beyond the Boundary was a transformative book for me that way, where I read, I must have been 14, 15 when I read. I was still very, very young, and I could not pick up a lot of the connotations about, what a, a person from the Caribbean islands has to go through in England, and why the West Indies were a certain way, and why even they did not have, a black captain for so long. Um, I mean, a lot of that was very influential in making me gravitate more towards the writing and wanting eventually to write more long form than your news reportage. So from a writing, it was that. Uh, from a music perspective, I was obviously exposed to a lot of Rabindra Sangeet growing up because that's what grandmom specialized in. Um, Dad had come back from the US, I think must have been around 2000, 2001, and there he was exposed to a lot of music from the US, your Guns N' Roses and your Pink Floyds and all that stuff. And he got back a bunch of cassettes, Deep Purple, Floyd. I remember there was Pulse, the concert, Floyd concert. He had got a cassette for that. He got a cassette for Guns N' Roses. Definitely a lot of Deep Purple, a lot of Clapton. So again, that I was fed a lot of that very young, and not obviously with an intention to, okay, you should play or anything of that sort, but just a different kind of music from what I was listening to every day at home. And grandmom had those. She had a harmonium, which as a kid, the harmonium is the worst instrument you would want around you. But I remember she got a small Panasonic keyboard. It must have been 21 keys. And I was obsessed with the game Mario. Like, I was playing it day and night. And the Mario intro music it catches on. Once you listen to it, you can't get past it. And because I was playing so much, it was constantly running in my head. So I remember trying to play it on the Casio keyboard, and I must have gotten 2 or 3 notes right. That's about it. And I think from there it was just that, oh, this is very cool. I'd like to play this song that I like. Like, I remember really liking Comfortably Numb. I was very young, but just something about the song just got on with me. And I was like, okay, I want to play just the basic things. And then grandmom taught me about chords and scales. But her thing was learn your craft, which was very, very helpful. She would teach me about that. Okay, you should know your scales before you know your songs. Yeah. Songs will come. Your scales are your building blocks. And these are the scales, these are the scales, these are the scales. I had a teacher for a very short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 weeks. He flaked. But he too was nice in the way where he came and said, okay, you should know your C major from your C minor. And then I can teach you, for example, a Pehla Nasha, how to play Pehla Nasha, but you should know your C major. And you should practice it. You should get your right hand right. Eventually, you will get your left hand right. So that was just on the side. I don't think anyone from my family wanted me to pursue these as professions, but as something I was doing on the side, using my time in quotes productively, I think they were more than happy.
Yeah, because I'm looking at your work as a fan as well, Sarthak. And I know in your introduction to Lines on the Grass, you spoke about that being an important perspective or lens through which you come to your writing and music, right? When I read, something you've written on Lines on the Grass, at least your profiles or the other pieces that you've written, for me, I feel like I'm immersed in that world again. You're not only recreating that world, I feel like you are showing me sides of that world that I may not be able to see in live action mode. Where I'm looking at the psychology of the athlete. I'm looking at the instances or the incidents that happened around that event. And I know music is something you also plan to write about, coming ahead. I love the little piece you wrote in your introduction about the music in the movie Kala, and you spoke about how the artist actually, bought something in that was very different and uncommon for that sort of space, and was able to create something that sounded pleasant. These were things that I saw as a fan coming into your work, and I think that's That's a very different perspective of looking at a game or looking at music in general. Growing up in cities like Calcutta and Delhi, or like I grew up in, like, Mumbai is my city. I'm curious about your take on fandom, or the fan culture in cities. Like, what did you observe as a fan growing up in Calcutta and Delhi, and what are you seeing about the idea of being a fan in different cities around India?
Um, that's actually a very good question, because usually, and rightfully so, fandom is it's very parochial. Like, if you're a fan, I was born into a family of 3, 4, 5 generations of Mohan Bagan loyalists.
Yeah, congrats
Um,
on winning.
yeah, and so, and this is not to turn the chat morbid, but I remember a week before Granddad passed, and by that time he was close to the full stop. I remember there was the league going on, a some cup, and I remember him asking that, "Yo, what's the score?" Um, I can confirm he did not say "yo," but you get the point. Uh, but no, so he was very parochial about Mohan Bagan in the sense that he wanted the rivals East Bengal to be beaten. And because you're from Calcutta, and this was a generation of people from Calcutta, the um, the inclination towards Mohan Bagan was very real. Like, it wasn't something you were inclined towards on the weekend when the match happened. You felt it. And we had some friends and relatives who had migrated from Bangladesh at some point, and that's the history of East Bengal being formed, because there was a migration from Bangladesh long back. And he would banter them, like, if East Bengal lost and Mohun Bagan beat them, even if Mohun Bagan lost the title, he would banter them. The reason I mention this is that was a very small subset of sports fandom, in terms of the education I got used to. Because, like I said, at home, he would watch East Bengal play, I don't know, Toligan's Ogragami, just, or Salgaonkar, and he would, through gritted teeth, but if it was East Bengal versus Salgaonkar, he would say, okay, this guy's playing well, that guy's playing well. And when Premier League happened, and when I was already watching international football, because those were telecast on Doordarshan, any big tournaments, all of us were Brazil fans. But we would watch an Argentina play Italy. We would watch an Italy play France at the 98 World Cup quarterfinal. And with a lot of interest, not just, okay, we are watching because there's nothing else to do. Because the love was for the sport. Yeah. The love was for cricket and football and tennis and hockey and whatnot. So, not that it was ever mentioned like verbatim, but that idea of, okay, we are all attached to the sport, and then we are attached to our teams rather than the other way around. That got imbibed into me early. But also, it is very understandable where fandom becomes parochial if your lens to the sport is through your team. So, for example, what has happened of India now is, now we are not fans of the Indian cricket team. Yeah. Now we are Rohit fans and Kohli fans and Dhoni fans. Yeah. I don't know if I wanted to get into a discussion of how unhealthy that is, but that's just how it is, and that's how cricket also is marketed. If you see the IPL's on, right? If you see how the promos are cut, it is Rohit taking on Kohli. It is not Mumbai Indians versus Royal Challengers Bangalore. It is not India versus Australia anymore. It is Kohli on Cummins. Yeah. And that's how cricket has been marketed. Cricket has been, like, on most sports. It's not just cricket. The change has happened more recently. But even few years back, I remember the El Clasico on Sony or whichever channel was broadcasting it. It was marketed as Messi versus Ronaldo. Now, when there are two people at the top of their powers, you understand it. But a lot of the discussion in the studios, in the pre-game shows, in the post-game shows, in the commentary, it all feeds into it. My most recent piece was on Dhoni, and we all know what's been happening with the CSK fandom, where their fans are really loyal. And for a long time, I was quite amazed by how enthusiastic they all were towards CSK. And because I spent so much time in Chennai. There is a sea change now. Not in everyone, I don't want to use a broad brush here, but there is a sea change in how that part of their culture has now moved to, they're all here for Dhoni. And if you go to the stadiums these days, it is a lot about as long as Dhoni hits a boundary, it's the $4,000 we've paid to watch this game is worth it. We don't care if CSK wins. And there are clips where when CSK batters get out, the CSK fans are celebrating because Thala is going to come play. And I have been at the stadium and seen the same. It's pretty much the same of what I heard about when Kohli played for Delhi recently in that one match. Kotla emptied when Kohli got out. So fandom, I don't want to pin this on the fans because that's the diet they have been fed, where now it's all about the cult individuals. It's not so much about the sport. And this is global. This is not at all an India specific thing. This is absolutely global, where it's like you must pick a side. There is no chance you can be a Federer and Nadal fan. You have to pick. And if you like Alcaraz, and if you tell me you like Alcaraz, I, within the next 10 seconds, will tell you why Federer at 21 was a better player than Alcaraz. And it's a lot of cherry picking, but that's just the nature of how sports is marketed, because it's competing for your attention with White Lotus and Black Mirror. And Brian Phillips wrote a very nice piece on Ringer recently where he said that we also, even are the most ardent of fans, right? We are no different to the fan who wears a Dhoni tattoo on their face. We're the same people. We are all consuming sports through reels, through memes, through these small clips that even the boards and the administrators and the teams are putting on social media. And for that economy to sustain, you can't harp on about, okay, collective. Dhoni hasn't won the 2011 World Cup, India won. Dhoni didn't win the Champions Trophy in 2013, India won. So that sentiment isn't there. And that's because there is no interest in pushing that sentiment. So fandom, I think, from a cultural perspective, that change I have seen happen in even the most emotional ties. That's why I took this long tangent. Because I spent so much time in Chennai and I saw so many CSK games where the focus was CSK. Obviously, Dhoni was their talisman, but the focus was CSK. That's not true anymore. And that is completely true of Bangalore. That is completely true of Delhi. I do have a soft spot for how Mumbai follows cricket because it's a little more ingrained. It's a cultural pillar. Cricket is a cultural pillar in Mumbai. So I do think there's a slight difference where, yes, what happened with Rohit and Hardik was abhorrent and like the less spoken about, like the more spoken about it, like it's important. But just purely from a Mumbai perspective, how they react to cricket is slightly different. But yes, I think fandom as a concept across the world has changed.
Yeah, and like there's so much to unpack there because I was thinking about this in the context of two shows that I recently saw. One was The Last Dance, where Michael Jordan's and like a big argument, like a thesis in that show was Michael Jordan's claim that the players are bigger than the team, in that context, and even the way, like if you look at the IPL, it's not a very old league. It's like 14, 18 years. But leagues like the NBA or the Premier League, they're primarily marketed as city-based leagues, and each city tries to acquire the services of a particular player that can take them through a decade, that can take them through like an era. And in franchise like sports, whether it's the NBA, the NFL, all of these leagues, I feel like that tension between the player and the team constantly sort of comes up. And I think the way you articulated it was quite important. When I feel like as fans sometimes we forget, and I'm thinking about this from the context of a player as well, Sarthak, because I played junior cricket and I remember thinking about the amount of effort it takes to get skilled as a bowler or a batsman or a wicket keeper. It takes years and years of effort, and then you also have a very small window where you can peak. If you're playing professional sports, and you notice that sort of slowing down after a while. So I feel like understanding that effort and that time it takes, and then for a person to peak, it's not just a random occurrence. I feel like it is years of cumulative effort coming up to that moment. And I feel like to appreciate that is something that, that deserves attention. It's human effort built up over ages that we're actually being a fan of. It's not just, a 4 or a 6 or a goal that we are appreciating in that moment. So yeah, I mean, what you were saying just hit so many tangents. I mean, like thought points for me. I was just thinking about it out loud, and I completely agree. I feel like every city has its own dynamic. Like Mumbai. If you look at the IPL, for instance, every city sort of develops its own culture. It's interesting how Mumbai and CSK, with their strategy, has been able to win all these titles. And you sort of look at it from that vantage point, where the team that has won, you think they have the best strategy. But I feel like there are teams like Rajasthan that have always promoted younger players that have strategies that are also very, progressive and modern, but they've not been able to get that kind of success. So, that's about fandom, Sarthak, but just coming back to your journey and your, you know just your journey in general. Like, I know in a previous life you were a software engineer. I'd like to break that down a bit, a little. Like, after high school, what was your experience in the university years? Apart from writing and music, was there that curiosity for computers growing up? And can you tell me a little bit about your early professional years too? So just that life as a software engineer and what you sort of learned from it.
Uh, I think we're all very curious about computers and the internet because we grew up at a time when it was still new to us.
Yeah.
So I think regardless of what we took up as professions later, we were all because something new was happening every other week on the internet or in the space of tech.
Yeah.
We weren't as used to tech doing so much as we are, I guess, now. So that curiosity was there, right? I guess for everyone. I mean, for the lack of a better word, I was forced into computer science because when I told them that, hey, I might want to take up something like music or in arts, my family just smirked on my face like, hey, just go back to your room. And so, yeah, I think from it wasn't an organic movement towards computer science. I did it because I had to. There wasn't an option. Regarding college, I studied at this amazing college. It's a cultural hotspot, and it embraces all sorts of arts and culture. It's called Amity. And I would heavily suggest to anyone watching, do not send people to Amity. Amity, actually, business is good, but Amity engineering just don't. No studies happened. We had computer labs like periods assigned, and when we go to computer labs, there were no computers for the first sem. In the second sem, the computers did not have Linux operating system, and for programming, you have to use Linux. And then they commissioned some random operating system built on top of Linux where half of the commands won't run. So yeah, like Amity, I can't wait to forget that memory. These things kept happening on the side, like the music and writing. I was in bands. I used to play in the Delhi circuit. I played a bit in the college circuit, and that just happened on the side. Um, I was I was the editor of the school magazine, so there in some ways I guess writing in some capacity, but still not in a semi-pro or definitely a professional kind of standpoint. Since you asked about earlier, I was lucky with the places I worked in. First couple, especially because of the people I worked with. I worked with some great people. My first company, there were 3 or 4 people. It was a startup that could barely be called a startup. My second company was very scammy, but there were some very nice people there. Again, my third company was amazing in terms of the friends I made there, the people I worked with, the managers I had. So that way, I was very lucky. And one thing I drew quite early in my life was a boundary that I know that I want to pursue music and writing as my focus, like professions or careers. And I'm doing tech to pay my bills. And for the most part, I was lucky with managers. Um, barring one manager in that second company, I was very lucky where no one pushed that, okay, no, you have to work 15 hours a day. They were appreciative of it, and they accommodated it as and when they can. So yeah, I was very lucky with my workplaces. My work was, I mean, boring to anyone who doesn't like it, but uh, with workspaces, with people, I was very lucky.
Yeah, and like, even that journey you navigated, like looking back, do you think you would do things differently, Sarthak? Like if you could maybe pursue like a structured program in writing or music, you think that would have changed anything for you?
It's a difficult one because to say yes, I mean, obviously, I would have liked to pursue these things that I was naturally inclined towards.
Yeah.
And this is true of, I guess, most of our generation, where there wasn't enough appreciation was for alternate careers, where you know your parents at home were not naturally saying, "Oh, you want to be a writer? Take up writing," unless they had a writing background, they had an art background. Um, so for me, I mean, it's easy for me to say that yes, I would have chosen differently, and I would have, picked up writing and picked up music, because I was, by the time it came to a point where I had to choose my career and my profession and which college I was going to, I was already showing some sort of aptitude in both these things. But what is also very true is that um, I don't think you can just, like, there would have been nothing where I could have done, and my folks would have said that, okay, now, okay, you don't need to do engineering.
Yeah.
Um, so that wouldn't have happened. And yeah, I would like to believe I'm more glass half full.
Yeah.
So there have been things that, because with music and writing, I've been mostly self-taught, and there have been things that I've picked up which may or may not have happened if I was going through a structured program. It's just conjecture, but in the spirit of this conjecture, I do cherish a lot of things that I taught myself, and things that I had to learn, unlearn, relearn, and go through that process, because I was failing, and I was writing pieces that were trash, and I was writing music pieces which sounded horrible even to my ears.
Yeah.
And you learn your sounds, you learn your words and your rhythm, and so yeah, I'm quite okay with where I am.
Yeah, very interesting, Sadhik. Because I think, the place that you are at in your life, I don't think it's very common for because when you say alternate careers, the scope of alternate was so limited as well for many of us growing up in the 90s. Like engineering, law, and medicine were primarily the three options you had. And then
100%.
writing, which is considered like a real profession in most countries, or like being a journalist or whatever, that can manifest as was not considered. So, we had a very small window if you came from a certain middle class upbringing in living in a tier one city. That was sort of the direction. So the fact, and also I feel like I this is also just thinking and reflecting on your experience and my own experience. Like even with podcasting, I feel like I didn't have any training for it, but
Right.
being able to do it while doing another job gave me like a low pressure environment to test my skills. Like if I immediately wanted to get something out of this, I feel like I wouldn't be able to function in that world, because it does take a period of time to you know develop your skill set in whatever you want to do, right? So
Totally.
I feel like having that low pressure environment where you were just exploring things in that childlike curiosity way, I think somehow adds up to something in the long run. But I'm coming back to writing, Sarthak. I'm curious about how you structure your pieces as a writer. Because there are several pieces that you write. I'm like, have you spoken to this athlete? Like, how do you know so much about this person's mind? Have you been at these matches? So, maybe if you could break down one or two pieces for me, like maybe I know cricket is like a big part of your writing, but you've written excellent pieces on tennis, on wrestling. Like it's not just one sport that you talk about. So if you could break down one or two pieces and where it's coming from, I'd really like to understand your thinking as a writer there.
Right. I think I can. It's hard for me to talk about my older pieces,
Yeah,
but if I have to, um, I can probably pick up Nadal and Dinesh Fogart. Does that work?
yeah, yeah,
Okay. So I can start with Nadal. So Nadal, that was the week, if I remember correctly, of the England-Pakistan Test series, and because I remember having a piece titled "Multani Mitti." I am a huge fan of punts, and Multani Mitti just worked because it was the pitch in Multan which did the work and which beat basically, which led to that situation. So I had that piece almost ready because it was a very straightforward piece. And then on the Thursday afternoon, our time, Nadal posts that video where he announces his retirement. And I knew I had to write. So what helped massively, a few things just fell into place where you have such little time, where the piece has to go on the Sunday morning and you are writing on Thursday. And I was not ever going to write about, okay, he won this much, he did that, he did that, he did that, and I was not going to write a Wikipedia entry for him. So the paucity of time really helped me narrow down to, okay, I am very clear about what I want to write. So while writing for Lines in the Grass, at least, one thing that I try to keep, I don't know if I'm always successful, but I try to keep in mind is that if I were to be given a mic and if I was speaking to a room full of people who had no idea about this sport or the athlete, what would I talk to them about? And I feel scorecards and numbers are a reduction of what the people are, like in terms of what the athlete is or what the person behind their feet is. So if I was to talk to a room full of people who did not know Nadal, I was most definitely going to talk about his intensity and his relentless intensity. For the lack of a better phrase, the intensity of his intensity, right? And so that became a thread for me. So on my pen and paper, I just drew a thread that, okay, from start to end, talk about intensity. The thing that also, as an intro, it fell into place was the Nadal ad with Carlos Moya, because you could almost structure your piece like that ad is structured. That ad is written wonderfully, where the first frame is Nadal playing Moya when Nadal was 16. And the commentator says something which is also true of when Nadal finishes. That's a montage of his career achievements. So I could almost pick from that, and I said, okay, that ad works great as my intro to Nadal. I will write the rest of the piece like how I'd want to. So that ad works great. Another thing, like what it's a bit of a flavor thing I do, where I like to give parallels. Like, so for example, if this is what I am seeing with Nadal, what does either the contrast feel like or what does a similar thing feel like? And my biggest problem with Manchester United is that there is no intensity on the pitch 9 days out of 10. Against an Arsenal away, they will show great team spirit and intensity and everyone will play together. But against Ipswich at home, they will look like they've never played football. So that's been my problem with United for now 10 years. So, and it so happened that it was on a weekend where there was no international game. So that first line of the piece it just fell into my lap, where my favorite thing about this weekend is that Man United do not play football. And I meant it. Like, I like it when I don't have to watch United play. And then I could do a short intro into intensity through United without ever calling it out. That worked as a setup, that this is my feeling of, this is what I feel about intensity. And immediately that Nike ad became my segue. And then it was about starting that, okay, the first time we saw Nadal and the first few tournaments we saw of Nadal, we were blown away by his intensity, but we also knew that this can't last. This is here today, not here tomorrow, which tournament by tournament was proven wrong by this guy. So rather than going that route, I was like, okay, why did it feel like it can't happen? What about tennis makes it not conducive to someone with that intensity? So that's something I explored with the, opera house kind of aesthetic. Yeah. And then once he built into his career, I had a very easy thread, which was Nadal's Australian Open final in 2012. And 10 years later, the Australian Open final in 2022. And both are the two longest Grand Slam finals ever played in men's tennis. Yeah. So I could just build that bridge. I had the two pillars ready for me. It was very easy for me to tap into that. So the structure was just that. And obviously, I was going to come back to that Nike ad at the end because it just becomes a circle for me. So a Nadal piece was written quickly, definitely carefully, but very quickly because I did not have time to explore different kinds of structures. I had to do one structure.
Yeah, like just to like jump in there, Sarthak. Like
Yeah, please go ahead.
when you were breaking this down, there are so many artistic or creative sort of like directions you had to take, whether it's drawing those parallels, whether it's making that connection between those two grand slams, focusing on that theme of intensity, but bringing in the idea of an advertisement or your fandom for Manchester United. I think this is so much more richer than just looking at Nadal and saying that he's won so many grand slams. And it's also this element of subjectivity where
Yeah,
Nadal is different in everyone's mind. Like I don't just want to know Rafael Nadal. I want to know what is Rafael Nadal in your mind as a fan, as Sarthak. Because in my memory, Rafael Nadal is a certain player, winning the French Open. But when I see, and I think it's this weird mishmash of all the Rafael Nadals coming out in our heads and how we articulate them that create this subcultural image of who that person is. But
yeah.
I think there is so much more nuance to that I think you bring out beautifully by taking these tangents in your piece. So just sorry, I just wanted to point that out
No,
as
no, thank you so much, man. Yeah, so one thing, like you rightly mentioned, if I tell you that Rafael Nadal won these many Grand Slams, these many games, did this in French Open, won the Olympics as for singles and doubles, and if you give me your 3 minutes in listening to this, am I adding any value?
yeah, I can get this
I'm,
off.
I'm really not.
Yeah,
There is a place for these kind of pieces, and there is that pace. Like the places are absolutely justified. When you're doing a certain kind of reportage, you have to do your W's and H, right? The what, where, when, how. That's absolutely fair, justified, no shade on that. But if I am writing on my own, say, blog or on my own space, where I have the liberty to write whatever I want, I do not want to talk about the number of his Grand Slams even once. I don't know if I've even mentioned how many Grand Slams he's won. I mentioned that he went past Federer because that it it was important in the metaphor of Nadal breaking limits that we set for him. When Federer reached 20, we did not think anyone could beat 20, and then he broke 20. So that went in that theme of every time we set a limit for him in our minds, he would break that limit. So yeah, it's something I like doing where I don't, unless the story demands it or unless a certain part of the story demands it, I don't like to go into how many runs has Tendulkar scored because that really doesn't matter. Like and because I want to share a piece of how I think about Nadal through that essay, right? Like you mentioned. To me, Nadal, I would forget the number of Grand Slams Nadal has won tomorrow.
yeah.
I would not forget how Nadal made me feel when I was watching, what I felt about Nadal when I was watching him. So that is more key for me to reflect in the piece. Vinesh was different because it was such a shocking turn of events, and I was very cautious of writing that piece. I am very cautious of speaking about Vinesh for multiple reasons, which I ended up making the last section of the piece, right? Where the only time I follow wrestling is during the Olympics and Commonwealth Games. I do not keep a tab on wrestling. I follow some great journalists, Indian journalists like Vinayak and Anirudh Menon. So their tweets and everything else might pop up, and I might get to know, okay, this person has won, that person has won. But I don't keep tabs, like I don't actively follow wrestling. So to write about wrestling as a sport felt pretentious. To write about a female who has gone through what Vinesh has felt mega pretentious. And like, because what do I know of her? I don't know anything about her. And I haven't, as a privileged male who has studied in an English medium school, who has only lived in tier 1 cities, who the only time he watches wrestling is in an AC room, I am in no place to talk about Vinesh Fogart. But Vinesh was important to me because when we build these heroes in our minds of a Tendulkar and for a younger generation, certainly a Kohli, Rohit, Dhoni, whatever, what are we looking at them as?
Mm.
Just not their runs. They have to be something more than the number of centuries they score and the number of runs they score. So that was the thought. And then the structure that I thought was possible, because I had to talk about what happened. And that was going to be my starting point as to, because the shock built from there. And if I can be completely honest, I probably wouldn't have written a Vinesh Fogart piece if that incident hadn't happened. If she won gold, maybe, and it would have been a different kind of piece. But she was guaranteed a silver, right? So maybe a different kind of piece. But had this been not so dramatic, had she not gone through, the early rounds, I wouldn't have written that piece, because I don't follow wrestling. So I wouldn't have tried to write a piece about a sport I don't follow. So that piece was my starting point for wanting to write. That situation was my starting point for wanting to write. So I wanted to. The first zoom out was the incident was the starting point. The first zoom out was, do we know how good Vinesh is? I don't think there is enough spoken about. She's a phenomenal wrestler. She's won everything. The only thing she hasn't won are Olympic medals. She broke her ACL in Rio. She ruptured her ACL in Rio, and she was winning a tie, and she was taken out in Tokyo. Or there was another injury. I forget. But basically, it was very unfortunate, and she entered as one of the favorites to win a medal. And India has a long line of success with wrestling. Every time they win something, and Vinesh is still one of their best. So the second zoom would have been, I don't think we know how good Vinesh is and how richly deserved this medal would have been for her. And the third zoom out was, if she won Olympic golds in all of her events that she's taken part of in all Olympics, all of them combined would not be as massive as what she's done outside the ring, what she stood for outside the ring. And that entire situation I followed with in a very detailed manner, very deeply, because it means something to me that sports, I know it's not pure, and there's a lot of capitalistic forces left, right, center, and we're all functions of that environment. But people shouldn't have to fight for their dignity here. And so it meant a lot to me that there were a bunch of wrestlers who were taking up a fight that they really didn't have to. So for me, that was beyond anything you could achieve on the field.
Yeah.
To fight for something greater than yourself, because now you're fighting for an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Now you're fighting against an establishment that jails you, that will kill you legitimately. So that was the next zoom out. And yeah, I mean, I wanted to end on the fact that this was not my piece to write. And I felt the same way when I wrote about Cristiano coming back to United. He's an admitted rapist. And sorry for that, using that word, but I think it's important to use it for him. Mason Greenwood, when he was being protected by United after certain kind of videos and audio came out, I was asked, because the Ronaldo piece went viral and it went to Al Jazeera and whatnot, I was asked by the football magazine that write the Mason Greenwood piece. And I was very uncomfortable. I was like, how many more times should a male write about these things, man?
Yeah.
And like, what do we know? So that was essentially, that sentiment came through when I was writing about Vinesh. But it was also important for me that I'm writing about her because I do feel she's a hero. What's happened post the Olympics with a political career, we hadn't known then. But that doesn't invalidate, even by a smidge, everything that she's done, everything that she stood for up until the Olympics. And maybe she will continue doing that even now. So structurally, from a craft perspective, that piece was a series of zoom outs, where Nadal's was a more linear, Vinesh's was more zoom outs. But the sentiment and the intention behind writing and even willingness was very different.
Yeah, and again, when I read the Vinesh Fogart piece, there were lots of things I was also thinking about. And I think the primary thing that stood out for me was what is the impact on this person's mental health as they're going through this over such an elongated period of time, and then and even the nature of the Olympics every 4 years, it's not a, like cricketers, they have a tournament coming up that is highly publicized. With other sports in India, we don't have that kind of media attention, you know, given to them regularly, so it's almost like they pop up every 4 years if you are not. And as you said, like, she's probably won most of the important medals in all these other wrestling tournaments that are as important, if not more
Yeah.
important, than the Olympics. But it's just the nature of media, and like how we place cricket on a pedestal, and we don't look at the years and years of effort. And I think I was speaking to another friend about how we were just thinking about how New Zealand, with 6 million people or so, is able to produce certain a quality of cricketer consistently. And I remember this friend that stays in New Zealand telling me that we grow up in places where there are grounds right outside our house, turf
Yeah.
pitches in our backyard. So from a very young age, these people are running in turf pitches, playing on these huge grounds, and it's almost like a cultural thing where if you don't play a sport, you are not doing something right in a social context. And I
Yeah.
remember Jonty Rhodes, I think I heard him say something recently, like he grew up where he could have played hockey internationally too for South Africa. He could have been a professional. So for him, taking up sports was almost second nature, which is not the case growing up in India, where, as you spoke about that career graph, if you're growing up in a particular way, you are encouraged to take a path. And then for you to take up sports, to find the investment for it, to continue to develop in it and get to a world class level, without the kind of ecosystem that can help you, I think these are anomalies and outliers rather than regularities that, we would consider. So I mean, a lot to think about there, and I don't want to go into, I feel like I will link both these pieces and some of your other pieces in the show notes for anyone that wants to explore that further. Like for the next part of this interview, Sarthak, I wanted to, like, if you had to create like an audio essay about, in your Substack intro, you said Floyd, football, and another thing can bring peace to the world. Was it
Food, food, Floyd, and football.
ball? Perfect. So let's unpack this a little bit. Like, if you had to tell me, like, I don't know Pink, like, I love Pink Floyd, and my favorite story of them is that story where one of their old band members comes up to a studio when they're making a song, and "Wish You Were Here" was sort of influenced by that old band member that unfortunately couldn't be with the band, but the band constantly remembers them, and their music has had like a very but for someone that doesn't know Pink Floyd, if you had to, in this like 5 minute stretch, tell me something about what is Pink Floyd for Sarthak. Like, how would you not even convince me, but share your love of what Pink Floyd has done for you as a listener.
Um, the kind of music I like most, and this is, I guess, is going to be a bit of a boring answer,
Yeah.
because the kind of music I like most is very spacious and minimal.
Hmm.
And this is true for music I like listening to and playing. Um, so Floyd, when I heard for the first time, it was very different to your usual classic rock. It was very different to what Led Zeppelin were putting out. It was very different to anything that you'd heard from Beatles, uh, your metal bands and your Iron Maidens and Metallicas and Megadeths. Floyd was just so unique. And in their sound was, they would go like Shine on You Crazy Diamond is it's a 25-minute song.
Yeah.
So no one was doing that. Secondly, no one was being as experimental in this soundscape, so to speak, because you could listen to a Iron Maiden song. You could listen to an Iron Maiden guitar riff, and say it's Iron Maiden.
Hmm.
You can do that with Metallica. You could do that with Guns N' Roses. The certain kind of vocals, even AC/DC to an extent. Floyd was just, they could have a proper hard rock song and a song that has 5 notes playing for 10 minutes. So it was a lot of that. It was like just being very interested in what they are doing sonically from a craft perspective, like the theory of it, what kind of chords and what kind of stuff they're using, what kind of, because their music also has a lot of dissonances. They were not just playing within scales and within certain kind of modes as is spoken about. They were using a lot of dissonant notes, and they were creating music through that. They were creating a certain kind of ambience through that. So there was a lot of interest from a craft perspective, but there was also a lot of love for them writing a very comfortable music. Like when I listen to Floyd, I feel very comfortable. I don't feel like getting out of my chair and headbanging, which is not a bad thing. Like there are certain bands which make me do that. But I could just put on Floyd, lean back, and just pick up a book and chill the entire afternoon. And that's all my favorite artists are that kind, where I just feel relaxed when they are on my speakers. So it was a lot of that. Thankfully, the bands I was in were also of a similar kind of sensibility. So we played a lot of Floyd covers. In terms of just performance with a band, one of my favorite memories is playing Comfortably Numb at the end of our set to a packed MDI, Gurgaon. And we were far from one of the better bands on stage, but the reception we got because Comfortably Numb was at the end of our set. We would end with it. And the reception what we got was staggering. It was a college fest, and it was a late night gig, so I think we must have gone up on stage around 11:30. And a lot of people, like drunk, not drunk, partying, not partying, but they were all there. And when we played it, the noise was amazing. So I've played a lot of Floyd on stage. I sound check. If I'm ever on stage, I sound check either with a Floyd or Eric Satie, Gymnopedie #1. So yeah, it's just that. And both, even if you listen to Gymnopedie #1, it's also very spacious. The notes are allowed to breathe, and you really hear what a note is doing. And I just naturally like that kind of music.
Nice, and I really hope you're able to put out more music pieces on Lines on the Grass, Sarthak, because I feel like the way you talk about music and the things you notice, just as a listener, I feel like I'd be really curious about seeing that perspective and sharing that, passion and love for a particular band. Because sometimes I feel as a listener, because I don't play an instrument, can I not access the same things that someone that plays music? But then I feel differently. I feel like I can have a subjective reaction to a particular band based on my associations that'll be very different from someone. Because I think I listened to Pink Floyd at a particular point in my life, and without understanding, and I think you mentioned this in your intro to Lines on the Grass too, is that you don't need a PhD in cricket. You don't need to be a musician to enjoy
100%.
or to enjoy sports, right? And I feel like that's the beauty of an artist. They achieve such complexity, or an athlete too, but they're giving you joy in the most simple ways possible. It's at the end of the day, it's bringing you some comfort, and I love the way you put it in your piece as well. As someone that's working in journalism and sports writing, Sarthak, I'm curious about your take on how sports journalism has evolved in India over time. With do you feel like younger people are reading long form writing? How has it changed with the advent of the internet and other forms? And you mentioned like Substack being something you've adopted, and like how does it work for you? Like what have you seen as someone that's been part of this ecosystem, and what are your thoughts about where it's going to?
Wow. It's a great question. I just hadn't thought about it at a recent time. But I do think there's an appetite. I don't necessarily think long form writing, be it books, be it long form essays, have the same kind of audience as they would 20 years back, 25 years back, and naturally so. Internet has moved in a certain direction. And this is not a good versus bad kind of conversation, where most of the things we consume, and all of us consume reels, memes, and all that, they are essentially short form. So, not to go into the science of it, but how much long form content are we consuming um, has definitely lessened over time, because back in the day, our consumption of an art form, if we were to read about sports, we would read it in newspapers, in magazines, uh, or through news channels, or people who were talking at length.
Yeah.
And talking in context, talking in color, making it rich for the viewer was very much the currency, was part of your diktat as a journalist, writer, musician, whatever, which is not necessarily true today, because we are, and all of us consume that, right? We are in a short form content ecosystem economy. Uh, what is there, and I'm confident of it, is there is an appetite for reading that hasn't gone. I don't necessarily believe that people don't read books. Are they reading lesser books than before? Maybe, but they definitely read. And so it is a nice challenge for me to have, to keep people engaged with my long form content. I refuse to do listicles. I refuse to write hagiographies. But I do believe that there are people who are listening to these long podcasts. There are people who are listening to. There are people who are watching series and movies. And if Black Mirror can release a new season and have so many people watching it, is it not long form content? It is. Uh, and Vox puts out a series on Netflix, Vox Explained, and those are 10-12 minute videos. Johnny Harris on YouTube goes into, he talks about, literally, spoken about World Cup, football World Cups. He's spoken about the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia. He speaks about he's got a great range of topics, and he does this 20-25 minute video essays. Is that not long form content? Millions of people are watching it. And I can't believe I'm going to mention this guy, but in a way, your tequila triceps is also long form content. Good, bad is a separate conversation, but it is like his podcasts are not 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So to not to labor on the point, but yeah, I do think there is some appetite, definitely, but it's then on the writer, on the musician, on the podcast, on the podcast person, to make it interesting, to keep the viewer engaged.
Yeah.
Because if I lose you midway through my article, if it's too boring, then you will move on and you will watch that episode of Seinfeld. Of course you would. I would also. There are books that I've picked that I've been bored, and I'm a reader. And even I have picked up books and I'm like, I don't like this. And I've kept the book aside and I have watched something. I watched a YouTube video of, I don't know, somebody hitting someone with a spoon. But those are the avenues available to us. Back in the day, I think there weren't. So if we picked a book, it felt a little more sacred. I think Gavin Harrison, who was the drummer for Porcupine Tree, made a very valid point. He said that when he was growing up, you could buy one cassette once in a while or one CD. So he would buy that one tape and he would listen to it over and over, because that is the only new thing he has. He doesn't have another avenue. And by the time he's done with his 10th listening of the tape, he can drum it with his eyes closed, which is not going to be true for any drummer today. So it's, I guess, wrong to expect a drummer to listen to one record for 3 entire days and not do anything else. So yeah, I just think the economy is different today. The environment is different today, and there is definitely an appetite, but there is a far greater challenge on writers and musicians and podcasters to keep the audience engaged, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, because I think it's just that nature of abundance too, right? For someone growing up in the 80s in India, being part of that world, which is why when I was speaking to like a cousin who's in his early 40s, and he's someone that I get a lot of great recommendations from. And he was just, telling me that it's so like you've grown up in a world where you naturally have access, where you have all this. But growing up in the 80s, we just had one channel, and
Yeah.
watching movies was just once every week on a Sunday. and we had to like find very creative ways to even listen to something coming in from outside our country. Then over the last 20 to 30 years, suddenly being part of this world where suddenly you not only have access to music, but you have the entire catalog of an artist available. You have,
Yeah.
OTT bursting up with so many options for movies. You have even sports. Like it's crazy how our ability to access sports has changed significantly. From listening to it on radio in the 80s when India won the World Cup to now everyone taking it for a given that you'll be able to watch it on your device on the move. So even that distance and what that does to the fan as well, to the person viewing, listening, consuming. It's like that thing that Barry Schwartz said about the paradox of choice, where just because there are so many options, you are not going into something for a longer period, which I think also takes away from your experience of that particular piece of art,
It
where.
does. Because, like, and this is true for me, so I can speak for myself. There are albums when I was much younger where I would listen, if this was an artist I liked and they had released an album, I would listen to their entire album in one shot.
Mm,
Like that, I have listened to the entire, Dark Side of the Moon album, top to bottom, multiple times.
mm,
And the reward is in the last two tracks. The reward comes with Eclipse. There are great songs. Time is a great song, and there are other great songs. Asandam is a great song. Breathe is a great song. All of that. Great Gig in the Sky comes in. But when Eclipse comes, it's a concept album. And when Eclipse comes and everything comes together as a song, that is when the reward for going through this album is.
yeah.
I think there are two aspects to it. I fully agree that it is taking away. I can't remember. The reason I mentioned that is I can't remember the last time I heard a full album in one shot.
And you
I
are
haven't.
someone that actually plays and listens to
Yes.
music professionally.
So I am now listening per unit song, and the artist better bloody give something to me in that song. And like it could be anything. But to my taste, I have to be pleased by that song to click on okay, play the now. I'm willing to listen to the next one. And I think there are two things. I think Shefali Bhatt wrote a lovely piece on Mint, if I'm not wrong, that everything from marriages to what film composers are told when they're putting together a background score for a movie has been tuned for Instagram.
Yeah.
Where film composers are told that you have to have Instagrammable parts of the music. So basically what you call the hook.
Yeah.
And you have to have things which people can dance to. Obviously not true for every movie. You won't have it in, like, I guess, a deeply disturbing dark movie, but most movies follow this formula because that comes from the record company, that comes from the film producers company, that comes from the financiers. Because there is a lot of audience to be tapped into through your reels, through your TikToks. So the reason I mention this is there is also a change from a creator perspective, where creators are expected to, back in the day, they weren't expected to give you something every 5 minutes. Yeah. They could make a Shine on Your Crazy Diamond 25 minutes. No musician is going to put out a 25-minute track anymore. Yeah. As one of their major, like, flagship albums.
Yeah.
If an Ed Sheeran puts out a 25-minute piece of music, that will be accepted because next year there's another album. Last year there was an album. He would release a normal album around it. Yeah. It won't be their flagship album. So that, I feel that world only has changed, where even as people who appreciate long form content, who engage in a lot of books, music, slow burn movies, even I don't think we engage with art the same way we did when we were younger. We have changed. And we expect different things from a song than we did 20 years back. And because if the song is not doing something for me, I will move on. Yeah. And it comes from a musician or someone who deeply appreciates music, or anyone who's trying to play music. But I most definitely will move on because I will be bored. Yeah. So I also think there is a change from, like I said, creators who are the kind of art that we're putting out is of a different nature, where unless I give something to you, say in a 3,000 word piece, unless I keep you hooked at word 150 and then at word 450, if there is a slow burn between word 150 and word 1150, I will lose you. And even if you have put out your morning 10 minutes, you put in your coffee and you want to really read the piece, even then I would lose you. So I do think it's both ways, where we are engaging differently, but we're also creating differently.
Very true, very true. And you are more cognizant of that as someone creating like a creative piece as well. So the final question, Sarthak, thank you again for doing this. I really, really appreciate your time. And I think it's very hard to condense, all your years of work into a conversation. And I feel like the reason I'm doing this is also to create audio archives that you can come back to in time and, maybe reflect on, like this was who I was then, this was who I was now. And I feel like that is also a form of I feel like there is an art in conversation too, right? Where two people can bring their world together and talk about something. Because I feel like that documenting is something that I'm really curious about as an individual. And there's another podcast I listened to called Desert Island Discs, and I don't know if you've heard a couple of it, where they asked the guest a question, like if you were stranded on an island and you could take like 7 pieces of music with you that you could listen to. So I wanted to rephrase this question and maybe ask
Sure.
that to you in a different way. Like if you had to take the complete works of five individuals. This could be written like pieces, like books, or it could be entire album collections. So can you like share 5 things you would take with you if you were stranded on a desert island, and these were the only 5 things you could come back to over a period of time?
Definitely Floyd. That's an easy one.
Yeah,
And Floyd can, because it covers music completely for me.
yeah,
So I don't need another musician. If I have to pick from five, um, I would then pick V.S. Naipaul
yeah.
as my number one writer.
So all
I,
is work, right? Like,
all his work.
yeah,
I would pick Rahul Bhattacharya for purely stylistic writing. I think he's unbelievable. I wish he wrote more. I would pick Sharda Ugra for storytelling. That's four.
yeah.
And I would pick Brian Phillips for humor.
Awesome. Yeah. And on that note, we come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories. For the listeners tuning in, I will be linking Sarthak's music and Sarthak's writing in the show notes. I would really appreciate it. Or, I mean, the reason I wanted to do this podcast was because I got so much joy and delight out of reading and listening to Sarthak's music, but also reading his long form pieces. And as someone that loves music and sports, I found so much value in that engagement. So please do follow up this podcast with engaging with those pieces that are linked in the show notes. And until next time, keep learning.
Thank you for having me, Abhishek. It was lovely.
Thanks.